In the early 1800s, the United States was a nation filled with hope and ambition, yet beneath its surface, a deep and dangerous divide was growing. Two very different civilizations were developing inside the same country. In the North, industry and immigration fueled rapid change. In the South, plantations and slave labor built enormous wealth. These two systems did not simply disagree. They were destined to collide. The roots of this division stretched back to the founding of the nation. From the very beginning, slavery had been a contradiction woven into American life. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, yet nearly one-fifth of the population lived in bondage. The Constitution protected the rights of slaveholders, even as it avoided using the word slave. This fragile compromise allowed the new republic to form, but it planted seeds of conflict that would one day erupt into war. As the decades passed, the North and South grew apart not only in economics, but in culture, morality, and identity. In the North, industrialization transformed cities into centers of factories, railroads, and commerce. Immigrants from Europe poured into New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston, providing labor for growing industries. Wage labor became the backbone of the economy. Education spread, cities expanded, technology advanced. Many Northerners came to believe that free labormen working for wages, owning their own land, and building their own futures was the key to progress. The South developed along a completely different path. Its economy revolved around agriculture, especially cotton. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton extremely profitable, and planters expanded their plantations deeper into the South. But cotton was labor-intensive, and plantation owners depended on millions of enslaved African Americans to work the fields. Slavery became not just an economic system but a way of life. Southern elites built their wealth, status, and political power on the institution of human bondage. By the 1830s and 1840s, the gap between these two worlds had widened into a chasm. The North's growing industries gave it economic strength, while the South's cotton dominated global markets. Both regions believed their system was superior and both feared the rise of the other. Northerners saw slavery as backward, cruel, and incompatible with modern growth. Southerners viewed Northern industrial society as chaotic, morally corrupt, and dangerous to their traditions. The moral debate over slavery intensified. Abolitionists in the North rose to challenge the institution with fiery speeches, newspapers, and activism. William Lloyd Garrison denounced slavery as a sin. Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man, spoke with unmatched power about the brutality of bondage. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin stirred emotions across the North and horrified the South. Churches split into Northern and Southern branches over the issue. Politics grew increasingly bitter, but the South did not see slavery as an evil. Southern leaders defended it fiercely. They argued that their system was more humane than Northern wage labor. They claimed that enslaved people were cared for by their masters, while Northern workers suffered in factories. These arguments, steeped in racism and paternalism, helped slaveholders justify the system and protect their power. Some Southern politicians even called slavery a positive good, essential to civilization, and ordained by God. The conflict between free and slave labor became more than a debate. It became the defining ideological struggle of the nation. Every new state added to the Union threatened to upset the balance of power. Would it be free or slave? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily resolved this issue, drawing a line across the map dividing free and slave territory. But the compromise only postponed the inevitable. As the country expanded westward after the Mexican-American War, the question grew urgent. California, New Mexico, Utah, each new region reignited controversy. The Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the violent clashes in Bleeding Kansas revealed just how fragile the Union had become. The Dred Scott decision in 1857, which declared that African Americans could never be citizens, and that Congress had no right to limit slavery, shocked the North and emboldened the South. Economics, politics, and morality were now entangled in a battle for the soul of the nation. The North believed slavery should not expand into new states. Some Northerners wanted slavery ended altogether. Others simply wanted to protect white workers from competition with enslaved labor. But regardless of motive, most Northerners agreed that the future of America should be built on free labor and free soil. The South saw things differently. To them, restricting slavery was an attack on their way of life, their economy, and their honor. They believed that without slavery, their society would collapse. They feared being outnumbered in Congress, losing political influence, and becoming powerless in the face of Northern dominance. Southern leaders felt cornered, and when people feel cornered, they often choose conflict over compromise. By the late 1850s, the United States was no longer simply divided. It was two nations in all but name. One nation envisioned a modern society without slavery. The other believed that slavery was essential and non-negotiable. These differences were not minor disagreements. They were deeply rooted worldviews shaped by generations of culture, economy, and belief. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 would soon push this fragile nation past the breaking point. But even before Lincoln's victory, the country was already on a collision course. Slavery had become more than an economic system. It had become a symbol of power, identity, and destiny. The North and South were marching toward a confrontation neither could avoid. This was the real beginning of the American Civil War. Not a single event, but decades of division and expanding conflict of ideas, economies, and moral visions that would explode into the bloodiest war in American history. In the decades before the Civil War, the United States tried again and again to hold together a country being pulled apart by two incompatible systems. Every law, every debate, every political deal was an attempt to keep the nation from exploding. Yet each compromise only delayed the inevitable. As the 19th century unfolded, the United States inched closer to a breaking point, one failure at a time. The tension intensified in 1820, when Congress attempted to solve the first major crisis over slavery's expansion. Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state, which would give slaveholding states more power in Congress. Northerners resisted. Southerners demanded balance. The result was the Missouri Compromise. Missouri entered as a slave state, Maine entered as a free state, and a line was drawn across the map: slavery below, freedom above. It was a temporary fix, but it exposed the truth. The nation needed compromises, because its people no longer agreed on what America should be. As the country expanded westward, the political fights grew fiercer. The United States acquired massive new territories after the Mexican-American War in 1848. Land, stretching from Texas to California, opened an explosive question. Would slavery spread west, or would these territories be free? Politicians scrambled for solutions, but none satisfied both sides. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to settle the issue. California entered the Union as a free state, giving the North an advantage. But to appease the South, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, one of the most controversial laws in American history. It required Northerners, many of whom despised slavery, to help capture and return escaped enslaved people. Even free black citizens were at risk of being kidnapped and sold south. This law enraged Northern communities. Protests erupted. Vigilance committees formed to protect fugitives. Some Northern states passed personal liberty laws to resist federal enforcement. The South, however, believed the law did not go far enough. They demanded their property be protected in every part of the country. The country's foundation was beginning to crack. Then came 1854, and with it the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a political earthquake. This law allowed settlers in new territories to vote on whether they wanted slavery. Politicians called it popular sovereignty. In reality, it invited chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each determined to claim the territory for their cause. Violence broke out almost immediately. Homes were burned. Towns were attacked. People were killed. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas, a chilling preview of the war to come. The violence transformed national politics. Outrage over the Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered the old political parties. The Whig Party collapsed. In its place arose a new political force, the Republican Party, founded on one central principle: stopping the expansion of slavery. Not eliminating it, not attacking the South, simply preventing it from spreading west. But to the South, this was unacceptable. They believed restricting slavery was the first step toward destroying it entirely. While the country bled in Kansas, tensions exploded in Congress. In 1856, during a heated debate, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks walked across the Senate floor and beat Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death with a cane. Sumner had delivered a fiery speech condemning slavery. Brooks believed the speech insulted his family and his state. The attack shocked the nation. Northerners saw it as proof that slaveholders used violence to silence their enemies. Southerners celebrated Brooks as a hero. The brutality in the Senate chamber symbolized a deeper truth. Words were no longer enough. Violence was becoming the language of politics. But the moment that shattered any hope of peaceful compromise came in 1857, when the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom after living on free soil. Instead of granting him justice, the court ruled that African Americans free or enslaved could never be citizens of the United States. Worse, the court declared that Congress had no authority to stop slavery's expansion anywhere. The decision thrilled the South. It horrified the North. It erased decades of political agreements. It suggested that slavery might spread into every state, even the North. For many Northerners, it was a turning point. They began to believe that the political system itself was rigged in favor of the slaveholding elite. As the 1850s drew to a close, the political landscape had transformed beyond recognition. The two sides no longer trusted each other, and neither believed the federal government could protect their interests. The North feared a slave power conspiracy, a belief that Southern elites controlled Congress, the presidency, and even the Supreme Court. The South feared Northern domination, convinced that abolitionists threatened their security, their economy, and their existence. Then came a man whose words ignited both hope and fear: Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln rose to prominence during the 1858 Senate debates with Stephen Douglas. Though he lost the election, his speeches electrified the North. He argued that the nation could not remain half slave and half free. The South interpreted this as a direct threat. They believed Lincoln's rise meant the end of slavery and the end of their world. By the election of 1860, the United States was no longer a unified nation. It was two regions locked in a struggle for the country's soul. Trust had vanished. Compromise had failed. Every solution had only deepened the divide. When Lincoln won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote, the message was clear. The South felt outnumbered, vulnerable, and convinced that their way of life was under attack. The stage was set. The final crisis was moments away. The Union was breaking apart. The question was no longer if conflict would come, but when. By 1860, the United States was like a river swollen by decades of rising, surging, and pushing against its banks. Every compromise, every political battle, every violent clash had added pressure. The country was no longer simply divided. It was poised for rupture. And the spark that would ignite the final break was a tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not the most famous candidate in the 1860 election. He had never been governor. He had never served in a president's cabinet. But he had something the moment demanded: clarity. He believed that slavery must not spread into new territories. He did not call for immediate abolition everywhere. He did not threaten the South directly. Instead, he insisted that the federal government must stop slavery's expansion westward, to the North. This sounded reasonable. To the South, it sounded like the beginning of the end. The election of 1860 unfolded against a backdrop of fear. The Democratic Party, the only national party with support in both North and South, fractured into pieces. Northern Democrats supported Stephen Douglas and his idea of popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats rejected Douglas entirely and nominated John C. Breckinridge, who defended the expansion of slavery. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, emerged to beg for calm and compromise. But the country was beyond compromise. When the votes were counted, Lincoln won every northern state except New Jersey. He received 0 electoral votes from the South. Not one. He had been elected President of the United States without the support of an entire region. To Southern leaders, this was proof that their political power built over decades was slipping away. Without the ability to influence the presidency, the Senate, or the Supreme Court, they believed slavery itself was doomed. Fear became fuel, and fear pushed the first domino. On December 20, 1860, just 6 weeks after Lincoln's election, South Carolina declared that it was leaving the Union. The state justified its decision with a long list of grievances: northern states refusing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, abolitionist movements attacking Southern institutions, and the election of a president hostile to slavery. But beneath all the arguments lay one truth. South Carolina believed its survival depended on breaking away. Other Southern states watched closely. When nothing stopped South Carolina, no federal troops, no political pressure, they made their move. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. One by one, they announced that the Union no longer protected their rights. They claimed the right to secede, invoking the same spirit of independence that had fueled the American Revolution. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy created a constitution, elected Jefferson Davis as president, and began seizing federal forts and military supplies across the South. They believed the Union would not fight. After all, no state had ever seceded before. The Constitution was vague, and Lincoln had not yet taken office. The country entered a strange limbo divide, but not yet at war. As the crisis deepened, the outgoing president, James Buchanan, remained silent and paralyzed. He believed secession was unconstitutional, but he also believed the federal government had no right to force states back into the Union. His inaction allowed the Confederacy to grow stronger, better organized, and more confident. Meanwhile, Lincoln watched with growing alarm. He was still president-elect, powerless until March 4, 1861. But he made one thing clear: the Union was perpetual. He rejected any proposal that allowed the South to break away peacefully. He rejected new compromises that protected slavery's expansion. To Lincoln, allowing the Union to fragment would destroy the democratic experiment the founders had built. Yet he also knew that starting a war would rip the nation apart. When Lincoln finally stood on the Capitol steps on March 4 to deliver his first inaugural address, the tension was unbearable. Armed troops guarded the streets. Rumors of assassination filled the air. The Union was hanging by a thread. Lincoln spoke with a mixture of firmness and hope. He told the South he had no intention of ending slavery, where it already existed. He promised not to be the aggressor. But he also warned that secession was illegal, and that the federal government would hold, occupy, and possess its property, including military forts in the South. The message was clear. If the Confederacy attacked, the consequences would be catastrophic. The stage was set for the final confrontation. That confrontation came at Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, surrounded by Confederate territory. Lincoln needed to resupply the fort with food, not weapons. But the Confederacy believed allowing supplies through would show weakness. They demanded surrender. When the fort refused, Confederate cannons opened fire on April 12, 1861. The Civil War had begun. But the war did not start with cannon fire alone. It began with decades of political failure, moral conflict, and incompatible visions of the future. Lincoln's election was not the cause of the war. It was the moment when the nation finally admitted that the conflict could no longer be postponed. The secession crisis revealed a truth Americans had long avoided. The Union could not survive half slave and half free. The country had reached its breaking point. And as the smoke rose over Fort Sumter, the United States entered the deadliest struggle in its history. By the spring of 1861, the United States had become a nation divided, not just in politics, but in identity. Two flags flew over the same land. Two presidents claimed authority. Two visions fought for the future. And in Charleston Harbor, at a lonely brick fort surrounded by hostile guns, the final thread holding the Union together was about to break. Fort Sumter was a symbol more than a fortress. It stood on an artificial island at the entrance to Charleston, South Carolina state that had already abandoned the Union. Inside the fort, a small U.S. Army garrison held out under the command of Major Robert Anderson. They were isolated, outnumbered, and dangerously low on supplies. Around them, Confederate forces tightened their grip, building batteries, positioning cannons, and preparing for the moment when patience would run out. Lincoln faced a decision that would shape history. The garrison at Sumter needed food. Not ammunition, not reinforcements, just food. To send supplies would challenge the Confederacy's claim of independence. To abandon the fort would signal weakness and encourage further secession. Lincoln chose a middle path. He would send a relief expedition, but he would announce openly that it carried only provisions. No secret preparations, no surprise attack. When Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership received Lincoln's message, they saw it as a direct challenge. If they allowed supplies through, they believed it would legitimize the Union's presence in Confederate territory. If they attacked, they would ignite a war they were unsure they could win. Davis made the fateful decision. The fort must be taken. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, the stillness of Charleston Harbor shattered. Confederate guns opened fire, sending arcs of flame across the dark sky. The shells crashed into the brick walls of Fort Sumter. The bombardment echoed across the water, waking the city, filling the air with smoke and thunder. The war had begun. Inside the fort, Major Anderson's men scrambled to their posts. They returned fire with limited ammunition, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Confederate batteries pounded the fort, relentlessly, after hour, day after day. Buildings inside the fort caught fire. The barracks burned. Ammunition magazines threatened to explode. Yet remarkably, No one inside the fort was killed. The attack was meant to force surrender, not annihilation. After 34 hours of bombardment, Anderson agreed to a truce. On April 13th, he surrendered the fort. The U.S. flag came down, and Confederate troops claimed victory in the first engagement of the Civil War. The next day, Anderson and his soldiers boarded ships and sailed away, not defeated in spirit, but aware that the nation had crossed a point of no return. When the news reached the North, it sent shockwaves through the country. The attack on Sumter united the northern states in a way nothing else had. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Thousands rushed to enlist. Churches held rallies. Town squares filled with speeches, flags, and marching bands. Men who had never traveled far from home prepared for a war they believed would be short and glorious. But Lincoln's call for troops had another effect, one he did not intend. For more slaveholding states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina refused to send soldiers to fight their fellow Southerners. Instead, they joined the Confederacy. With Virginia's secession, the Confederacy gained industrial power, military leadership, and the symbolic home of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Richmond became the Confederate capital. The stakes grew higher. Now the country was truly divided. The line between North and South hardened. Families found themselves split, brothers on opposite sides, cousins facing one another across battlefields. Border states like Kentucky and Missouri became battlegrounds of loyalty, torn between Union and Confederacy. In Maryland, secessionist riots forced Lincoln to take drastic actions to keep Washington, D.C. from being surrounded by enemy territory. Both sides believed the war would be brief. Southern confidence soared after Fort Sumter. They believed Northern society was too divided, too soft, too unwilling to fight a long war. They believed European powers, desperate for Southern cotton, would rush to recognize Confederate independence. Many in the South felt they were fighting for honor, liberty, and sovereignty. The North believed the rebellion would collapse quickly, once faced with superior industry and manpower. Many expected the war to end within months, perhaps even weeks. Young men enlisted eagerly, afraid they might miss the action. Newspapers predicted a swift triumph. But beneath the confidence, both sides misunderstood the scale of what had begun. Each believed the other would give up easily. Neither understood that the war would last for brutal years and cost more American lives than any conflict before or since. The deeper truth was that Fort Sumter did not cause the Civil War, it revealed it. It exposed the fundamental conflict that had been building for decades. A nation split over slavery, freedom, and the meaning of America. The cannon fire in Charleston Harbor ended the age of compromise and began a struggle that would decide the nation's destiny. In the weeks after Sumter, armies formed, generals took command, and volunteer regiments marched to their first camps. The North and South prepared for battles that would test their strength, their resolve, and their humanity. The country entered a war that would reshape the national identity, destroy slavery, and leave scars that would last for generations. Fort Sumter was only the beginning. The bloodshed that awaited Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh would reveal the true cost of a conflict born from decades of division. The war had begun not with a massive battle, but with a symbolic spark. But that spark ignited a fire that would engulf an entire nation. When the first shots of the Civil War echoed over Charleston Harbor, neither side understood the scale of the storm they had unleashed. What many believed would be a brief conflict turned into a long, brutal struggle. The war unfolded across hundreds of miles, fields, forests, mountains, and rivers stained with blood. But in this vast landscape of violence, certain battles stood apart. They were moments when the future of the nation hung in the balance, when strategy, leadership, and sacrifice shaped the course of American history. The first major test came at Bull Run, also known as Manassas. In July 1861, thousands of civilians from Washington rode out to watch the battle, expecting an easy Union victory. What they saw instead was chaos. The inexperienced armies clashed in heat and confusion. At one critical moment, Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson stood firm against a Union assault, earning his famous nickname. The Union Army eventually broke, fleeing back toward Washington in panic. The myth of a quick war died that day. Both sides realized this conflict would be long and devastating. As the war dragged into 1862, President Lincoln searched desperately for a commander bold enough to strike the Confederacy's heart. He hoped that General George McClellan, head of the Army of the Potomac, would be that leader. McClellan was skilled at organizing troops. His soldiers loved him, but he was cautious, almost to a fault. He planned endlessly, hesitated constantly, and missed opportunities to crush the Confederate army. The Union launched its first major offensive in the Peninsula Campaign, advancing toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. But McClellan's hesitations allowed Confederate General Robert E. Lee, newly appointed to lead the Army of Northern Virginia, to seize the initiative. Lee attacked repeatedly in the 7 days battles, pushing McClellan back and saving Richmond from capture. It became clear that Lee was a brilliant tactician, aggressive, daring, and willing to take risks others would not. Lee then carried the war northward, attempting to threaten Washington and win foreign recognition for the Confederacy. This campaign led to one of the most important battles of the war, Antietam. On September 17, 1862, the two armies clashed near Sharpsburg, Maryland, in what became the bloodiest single day in American history. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The battle raged through cornfields, orchards, bridges, and sunken roads. Bodies lay so thick in some places that soldiers could walk across them without touching the ground. Tactically, Antietam was a draw. But strategically, it was a turning point. Lee's invasion of the North was halted. More importantly, the Union's defense gave Lincoln the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery. Enslaved people across the South saw hope, and thousands of African American men would soon join the Union Army, strengthening the Northern cause. But the Confederacy was far from defeated. In July 1863, Lee launched another invasion of the North, hoping to break Northern morale and force a negotiated peace. This led to the most famous battle of the Civil War, Gettysburg. For 3 days, from July 1 to 3, 1863, the hills and fields of Pennsylvania became a killing ground. The fighting at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield was fierce and unrelenting. On the third day, Lee ordered Pickett's charge, a massive assault across open ground into the heart of Union lines. The charge was heroic but doomed. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were cut down by artillery and rifle fire. When the survivors staggered back, Lee knew he had lost more than a battle. He had lost any chance of winning the war through invasion. Gettysburg was a turning point in the East. At the same time, another critical victory unfolded in the West. On July 4, 1863, after a long siege, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. The river was now fully under Union control, splitting the Confederacy in two. The South's supply lines were crippled, its territory divided, and its future darkened. From this point forward, the Confederacy could no longer win the war with bold offensives. It could only hope to survive long enough that Northern voters would tire of the conflict and demand peace. Grant soon took command of all Union armies. He was relentless, determined, and unafraid of heavy losses. His strategy was simple: keep pressuring Lee, engage him continuously, and grind down the Confederacy's shrinking resources. The result was a series of brutal battles, in 1864 the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. These were not clean victories. They were meat grinders. The forests caught fire, burning wounded soldiers alive, trenches filled with mud and blood. Thousands fell each day. While Grant hammered Lee in Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman launched a devastating campaign in the South. He captured Atlanta in September 1864, a victory that boosted Northern morale and helped Lincoln win re-election. Sherman then began his infamous march to the sea, cutting a swath through Georgia. He destroyed railroads, factories, and farms, aiming to break the South's will to fight. It was harsh, controversial, and effective. The Confederacy's infrastructure collapsed. By 1865, Lee was surrounded, exhausted, and outnumbered. Confederate soldiers were starving. Thousands deserted. The end was inevitable. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee met Grant to surrender. Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with dignity. The war was over. The major battles of the Civil War revealed the brutality of a nation divided. They showed the strength of leadership: Lee's brilliance, Grant's determination, Sherman's ruthlessness. They exposed the cost of political failure and the price paid by ordinary soldiers. And they shaped the outcome of a conflict that would redefine the United States. These battles were more than military events. They were turning points in American identity. They determined the fate of slavery, the meaning of liberty, and the direction of a nation struggling to fulfill its founding ideals. The war was far from clean or noble. It was bloody, chaotic, and filled with suffering. But out of that suffering, the United States emerged, transformed. The battles that scarred the landscape also forged a new vision of America, one that would face both triumph and tragedy in the years to come. When Americans imagine the Civil War, they often think of generals, strategies, and great battles. But the heart of the war was not fought only by officers on maps. It was lived by millions of ordinary people. Soldiers in muddy trenches, women guarding empty homes, children growing up beside cannon fire, enslaved people seizing their chance for freedom, and families torn apart forever. This was the human side of the Civil War, the everyday reality behind the headlines of history. For soldiers on the front lines, life was a mixture of fear, boredom, hunger, and exhaustion. Many were teenagers who had never traveled far from home. They marched for days under scorching sun, slept on the hard ground, and survived on rations of salt pork, hardtack biscuits, and whatever they could forage. Disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Camps became breeding grounds for dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, and infections. A simple cut could become deadly. Letters from soldiers reveal their emotional struggles. Some wrote with excitement, believing they were fighting for honor, for liberty, or for home. Others described cold nights, aching feet, and the constant terror of not knowing when a bullet or shell might end their life. They missed their families, their farms, their towns. They missed ordinary things: a warm meal, a feather bed, a familiar voice. Combat was unlike anything most had ever imagined. Battlefields filled with smoke so thick that soldiers could not see more than a few feet ahead. The sound of artillery shook the ground. Rifles cracked in deadly volleys. Men screamed in pain, called for help, or cried out for their mothers. The wounded lay on the battlefield for hours, or even days before being rescued. Some crawled to shade or water, some prayed, others simply waited. Field hospitals were scenes of horror. Surgeons worked for hours with limited supplies, amputating limbs to save lives, often without anesthesia. Blood covered the floors. Stretchers lined the walls. The smell of infection hung heavy in the air. For many soldiers, surviving a battle meant facing a long and uncertain recovery. Yet in all this suffering, soldiers formed deep bonds. They joked around campfires, sang songs, played cards, and told stories of home. They shared hardships, meals, dangers, and dreams. Their friendships helped them endure the unimaginable. While soldiers fought on distant fields, civilians faced a different war. In the North, life continued, but was overshadowed by anxiety. Families waited for news from the front, fearing the arrival of a telegram or a neighbor who would come with tragic news. Women took on new responsibilities, running farms, businesses, and factories. Many joined the war effort by sewing uniforms, rolling bandages, and raising funds. Northern cities became centers of production, with factories churning out weapons, ammunition, and supplies for the Union Army. In the South, the war came much closer to home. Battles ravaged towns, crops, and farmland. Families lived under constant threat of invasion. Inflation skyrocketed. Food grew scarce. Women struggled to feed their children. Many watched their homes burned or their belongings taken by soldiers. Some fled as refugees, carrying what little they could. Yet Southern civilians also showed resilience. Women organized aid societies, wrote letters to soldiers, and prayed for victory. Some supported the Confederate cause with fierce determination. Others quietly doubted the decisions of leaders, but felt powerless to change them. In many ways, the war exposed deep tensions within Southern society, between rich planters and poor farmers, between towns and rural areas, and between those who supported secession and those who did not. But no group experienced the war more profoundly than the enslaved people of the South. For them, the Civil War was not just a conflict between two governments, it was a gateway to freedom. From the earliest days of the war, enslaved men and women sensed that the conflict had the potential to change their lives forever. Many fled plantations, seeking refuge behind Union lines. Some escaped at night, traveling through forests and swamps, risking their lives for a chance at liberty. Others slowed down work on plantations, resisted orders, or spread news of Union victories. The movement of enslaved people by the tens of thousands forced Union generals to rethink their policies. Many enslaved people were declared contraband of war, housed in camps, or employed as laborers for the Union Army. As word spread that the Union Army offered hope, slaves left farms and plantations in greater numbers. Some joined contraband camps, which were overcrowded but filled with promise. Others sought work in Union-controlled towns, building roads, cooking, or serving as guides and scouts. Enslaved people possessed intimate knowledge of the Southern landscape, knowledge that often proved critical to Union victories. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, enslaved people in Confederate territory were declared free. This was not just a political document, it was a signal that the war had become a struggle for human liberation. Enslaved people celebrated, prayed, wept, and embraced one another. For others, freedom was delayed. Confederate territory still had to be captured. But the proclamation transformed the war's meaning forever. After emancipation, nearly 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army and Navy. They fought bravely in battles from Fort Wagner to Nashville. They built fortifications, transported supplies, and defended strategic positions. Many faced racism even within the Union ranks, receiving lower pay or harsh treatment. But they fought with extraordinary courage, proving their loyalty to the cause of freedom. The war changed daily life in countless ways. Newspapers became lifelines of information. Churches offered prayer and comfort. Schools struggled to stay open. Cities dealt with overcrowded hospitals, shortages of supplies, and waves of refugees. Even children were shaped by the war. They watched their fathers march off to battle, listened to distant gunfire, and learned to live with fear and uncertainty. The Civil War was not just a conflict of armies, it was a conflict that reached into every home and every heart. It transformed lives, reshaped families, and forced people to confront truths about freedom, justice, and sacrifice. For millions of Americans, the war was not an abstract struggle between North and South. It was lived every day in hunger, heartbreak, courage, and hope. Behind every battle map, behind every general's strategy, there were ordinary people holding together the fragments of their lives. Their stories of resilience, suffering, and survival are the foundation of the Civil War's legacy. When the Civil War began, Abraham Lincoln insisted that the Union's goal was simple: preserve the nation. But as the war unfolded, bloody, chaotic, and uncertain, the meaning of the conflict began to shift. The voices of enslaved people, the realities on the ground, and the consequences of every battle slowly transformed the war into something far greater. The Civil War became a war of emancipation, a struggle not just to save the Union, but to redefine the very idea of freedom in America. This transformation did not happen overnight. In the early months of the war, Lincoln faced enormous pressures. Border states like Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri remained in the Union, but they still practiced slavery. Lincoln feared that if he moved too quickly against slavery, these states might secede, collapsing the Union from within. He also faced Northern Democrats, who opposed abolition and believed the war should be fought strictly to restore the Union. But reality forced change. As Union armies pushed into the South, enslaved people took action long before the government did. Men, women, and children fled plantations, crossing into Union lines in search of freedom and protection. Some walked barefoot for miles. Others swam rivers or hid in forests. Their courage reshaped the war. Each escape challenged the idea that enslaved people were property. Each arrival forced Union commanders to answer the same question: what should be done with those seeking freedom? General Benjamin Butler offered the first bold answer. In 1861, he refused to return escaped slaves to Confederate owners. Instead, he declared them contraband of war. This meant they were no longer property, but people whose labor supported the Confederate cause and could now be used to help the Union. This decision spread quickly. The more the Union advanced, the more enslaved people fled. The war's momentum pushed the government toward a moral crossroads. Lincoln watched the situation evolve. Privately, he despised slavery and believed it violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Publicly, he moved cautiously, trying to balance military necessity with political reality. But by 1862, it became clear that slavery was the backbone of the Confederate economy. Ending it was not just a moral duty, it was a strategic necessity. The turning point came after the Union's hard-fought stand at Antietam. Though not a clear victory, it was enough to give Lincoln the opportunity he needed. On September 22, 1862, he announced that unless the Confederacy laid down its arms by January 1, 1863, he would declare all enslaved people in Confederate territory forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on New Year's Day, was not a perfect document. It did not free enslaved people in border states or areas already under Union control. But it transformed the war. The Union was no longer fighting only to restore the nation. It was fighting to end the institution that had divided the country since its founding. The proclamation sent shockwaves across America and around the world. Enslaved families rejoiced. prayed, wept, and celebrated. Slaveholders raged. Confederate leaders condemned it as an act of destruction. European nations, particularly Britain and France, who had considered supporting the Confederacy, backed away. They could not support a nation fighting to preserve slavery. Most importantly, the proclamation opened the door for black men to join the Union Army and Navy. Nearly 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors would eventually serve. They fought bravely at places like Fort Wagner, Port Hudson, and Nashville. They dug trenches, built fortifications, carried supplies, and risked their lives in battles where they were often targeted with ruthless cruelty. Many Union officers doubted their abilities. Some soldiers refused to fight alongside them. Yet the U.S. colored troops proved their courage time and again. They fought with determination, knowing that a Union victory meant freedom for themselves, their families, and millions still enslaved. The transformation of the war was not only political and military, it was spiritual. Black churches became centers of hope. Freedmen learned to read and write, often under dangerous conditions. Families torn apart by slavery sought to reunite. For the first time in American history, the promise of liberty seemed within reach for millions who had been denied it. But emancipation brought new challenges. Contraband camps filled with formerly enslaved families struggled with overcrowding, disease, and limited supplies. Union officials disagreed about how to manage the transition from bondage to freedom. Some advocated for justice and protection. Others acted with prejudice or indifference. Still, freedom was reshaping the South. Plantations collapsed as enslaved laborers walked away. The Confederate economy suffered, and as the Union advanced deeper into Southern territory, freedom followed in its wake. Lincoln's views evolved as well. The president who once prioritized preserving the Union, above all else, now spoke openly about ending slavery forever. He pushed for the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery in every state, free or border. He believed that the nation could never heal unless the institution that had caused so much suffering was permanently destroyed. Emancipation also transformed the Union Army. It became not just a fighting force, but a liberating one. Soldiers marched into Southern towns and plantations, reading the proclamation aloud to enslaved people. They witnessed celebrations, tears, prayers, and expressions of gratitude. For many Union soldiers, especially those who had never questioned slavery before, these experiences gave new meaning to the war. They understood that they were part of something greater than themselves, the remaking of America. By 1864 and 1865, as the Confederacy weakened, the movement toward freedom accelerated. Enslaved people organized schools, built communities, established churches, and prepared to shape their own future. The war had opened doors that could never be closed again. The Civil War had begun as a struggle to preserve the Union, but by the time the fighting reached its final chapters, it had become a revolution of the nation's moral and social foundations. The fight for emancipation challenged centuries of racial oppression and set the stage for battles that would continue long after the war ended. The transformation was profound. The United States was no longer the same country that had entered the conflict. With emancipation, the meaning of America itself had changed. Freedom was no longer a privilege for some, it was a promise for all. And that promise, written in blood and sacrifice, would reverberate across generations. By 1864, the Confederacy was fighting a war it could no longer win. Its armies were exhausted, its supplies dwindling, and its people worn down by years of sacrifice. The dream of independence that once burned fiercely across the South now flickered under the pressure of hunger, fear, and relentless Union attacks. The Confederacy had survived longer than many expected, but its final collapse was approaching, step by painful step. The turning point began with the rise of Ulysses S. Grant to command all Union armies. Grant understood the war's brutal logic. The Confederacy could not be defeated by capturing cities alone. It had to be worn down, its armies trapped, its will to fight crushed. Grant planned a massive, coordinated campaign on multiple fronts, a strategy designed to overwhelm the South's limited resources. In May 1864, Grant began his relentless offensive against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Their first clash came in the tangled forests of Virginia's wilderness. A battle so chaotic that men were burned alive as brush fires ignited from rifle fire. Smoke hung low, flames consumed the woods, and soldiers fought in confusion. Casualties were horrifying. But Grant did something no Union commander before him had done. After the battle, instead of retreating, he ordered his army to march south. This single decision told Lee everything he needed to know. Grant would not be stopped. The war was entering its final and most brutal stage. Grant and Lee collided again at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where soldiers fought hand-to-hand in trenches filled with mud and blood. At a place called the Bloody Angle, the fighting lasted nearly 24 hours. Rain soaked the battlefield, mixing with the blood of thousands. Trees were cut in half by bullets. For soldiers on both sides, Spotsylvania felt like a nightmare that refused to end. Still, Grant advanced. Lee's army grew smaller with every battle. The Confederacy could not replace its losses. Supplies ran low. Food grew scarce. Ammunition was hard to find. Yet Lee refused to surrender. He believed that if he could hold out long enough, Northern voters might tire of the war and force Lincoln to negotiate. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, the Union was closing in. General William Tecumseh Sherman marched towards Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's last major industrial cities. The battles around Atlanta were fierce, and Confederate forces fought desperately to defend it. But Sherman would not be stopped. In September 1864, he captured the city, setting fire to military facilities and destroying the Confederate war effort in the region. Atlanta's fall changed everything. It boosted Northern morale and helped Abraham Lincoln win re-election. With Lincoln secure in office, peace negotiations based on Confederate independence became impossible. The South now faced a government determined to fight until the rebellion was completely destroyed. Sherman pressed his advantage. In November, he left Atlanta and began his legendary march to the Saya campaign, designed to break the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Sherman's soldiers tore up railroad tracks, burned factories, seized crops, and destroyed supplies. They did not kill civilians, but they left nothing behind that could aid the Confederate army. It was a harsh strategy, meant to end the war faster and save lives in the long run. The impact was devastating. Southern infrastructure collapsed. Confederate soldiers deserted to help their starving families. The dream of independence faded into desperation. In the East, Grant tightened his grip around Petersburg and Richmond. After months of grinding siege warfare, Union forces finally broke through Confederate lines. In April 1865, Lee's army fled the capital, and Richmond fell to Union troops. Fires consumed parts of the city, set by retreating Confederates, hoping to destroy supplies before the Union arrived. The flames symbolized the burning end of the Confederacy. Lee knew the war was lost. His army was starving, surrounded, and hopelessly outnumbered. He attempted one final escape, hoping to reach supplies in the West. But Grant pursued relentlessly, cutting off every path. The final confrontation came at Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9, 1865, Lee realized escape was impossible. His troops were cornered. Ammunition was nearly gone. Men collapsed from hunger. Many could barely walk. Lee made the painful decision to surrender. Dressed in his finest uniform, he rode to meet Grant in the home of Wilmer McLean, a quiet farmhouse in a small Virginia village. Grant arrived dusty, mud-spattered, wearing the simple uniform of a working officer. The two generals spoke respectfully. They discussed the weather, exchanged polite words, and then turned to the matter at hand, ending the war. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home in peace. Officers could keep their arms. Men who owned horses could take them to plant crops for the spring. It was a gesture of mercy. Grant hoped that a compassionate peace would help heal a shattered nation. Lee accepted the terms with dignity. When he left the house, Union soldiers stood silently, honoring their defeated enemy. They understood the moment's weight. The war that had torn the nation apart was finally ending. In the days that followed, other Confederate armies surrendered. Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina, soldiers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. The Confederate government dissolved. Jefferson Davis fled, only to be captured. The Confederacy, born in fire and ambition, collapsed into ashes. Yet even in victory, the Union grieved. The cost had been unimaginably over 600,000 Americans dead, cities destroyed, families broken, entire communities scarred. The war had ended slavery, saved the Union, and reshaped the nation's identity. But its wounds would take generations to heal. The fall of the Confederacy was not a single moment. It was a slow, painful collapse of armies, of resources, of hope. The battles that led to its end revealed both the brilliance and the brutality of war. They showed the determination of soldiers on both sides and the harsh realities of a conflict that pushed the nation to its limits. The surrender at Appomattox did not end the story, opened a new chapter. Reconstruction, reunification, and the struggle for civil rights would define the years to come. But on that quiet April day, In a small farmhouse in Virginia, the fighting stopped. The guns fell silent. And a nation battered by 4 years of war took its first step toward rebuilding. When the guns fell silent in April 1865, the United States faced a new kind of battle, one without cannons or armies, but no less dangerous. The Civil War had ended, but the country lay shattered. Nearly every family had lost someone. Entire towns were destroyed. Millions of formerly enslaved people stood at the threshold of freedom, uncertain of what would come next. And the federal government confronted a task unlike any it had ever faced. Rebuilding not just a nation, but its very identity. The physical destruction was staggering. Railroads lay twisted and broken. Plantations, once symbols of wealth, were burned or abandoned. Cities like Richmond, Columbia, and Atlanta were reduced to rubble. In the countryside, fields went untended, farms were empty, and famine threatened thousands. The South's economy, built on the exploitation of enslaved labor, had collapsed. Its banks were ruined, its currency worthless, its future unclear. But the moral and political wreckage was even greater. Millions of people who had been enslaved woke up in a new reality. Freedom offered hope, but also fear. Families torn apart by slavery searched desperately for one another. Mothers placed notices in newspapers seeking children sold years earlier. Husbands and wives reunited after decades of separation. Preachers stood on makeshift platforms, reading aloud the Emancipation Proclamation and proclaiming a new dawn. These moments were filled with joy and tears, but they were also fragile. Freedom without land, money, education, or protection left many vulnerable. Former enslavers refused to accept the new order. Violence erupted. The question that haunted the nation was simple but profound. What does freedom truly mean? In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln had hoped for a gentle Reconstruction. He wanted the South restored quickly, without humiliation. He believed that forgiveness, not revenge, would heal the nation. But fate intervened. Only days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The nation plunged into grief. His death changed the course of Reconstruction. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked his vision and moral clarity. Johnson was a Southern Unionist who despised the wealthy planter class, but also opposed equality for Black Americans. Under his leadership, Southern states rejoined the Union too quickly. Former Confederate leaders returned to power. Legislatures across the South passed black codes, laws designed to control and restrict the freedom of newly freed people. These codes limited where black people could work, live, travel, or own property. Some states attempted to force black men and women back into plantation labor under new names. It was slavery, recreated in another form. Northern politicians, especially the radical Republicans, were outraged. They believed that the sacrifices of the war demanded a complete transformation of Southern society. They insisted that the federal government had a responsibility to protect the rights of freedmen and punish those who tried to resurrect the old order. In 1867, Congress acted, overriding Johnson's vetoes. They passed the Reconstruction Acts, placing the South under military rule. Former Confederate states had to rewrite their constitutions, recognize black rights, and ratify new amendments before being readmitted to the Union. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection. Under the law, the 15th Amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote. These amendments reshaped the Constitution and laid the foundation for future civil rights struggles. For the first time, the United States began to move toward the democratic promise it had long proclaimed but never fulfilled. Under the protection of federal troops, black communities flourished in ways once unimaginable. Freedmen built churches, schools, and businesses. They established newspapers, established farming cooperatives, and joined social and political organizations. Education became a revolution. Many freed people flocked to classrooms, eager to learn to read and write. Northern missionaries and teachers, black and white, traveled south to help. Black men participated in politics for the first time in American history. They served as sheriffs, legislators, judges, and congressmen. To black senators Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce represented Mississippi in the U.S. Senate. Their presence in government symbolized a dramatic shift underway. But these changes provoked fierce resistance. Many white Southerners were unwilling to accept equality. Armed groups formed in the shadows. Most infamously, the Ku Klux Klan. Created in 1866, the Klan used terror, arson, beatings, and lynchings to intimidate black voters, and anyone who supported Reconstruction. Their violence threatened to undo the progress being made. Federal authorities fought back, passing laws to crush the Klan, and for a time, the organization was suppressed. But the struggle for justice remained constant and exhausting. Meanwhile, the economic challenges of Reconstruction grew heavier. Freedmen needed land to build independent lives. Many believed the promise of 40 acres and a mule would become reality, promise linked to a brief order issued by General Sherman. But President Johnson reversed the policy, returning vast tracts of land to former Confederates. Without land, many freed people were forced into sharecropping, a system that trapped them in cycles of debt and dependence. As years passed, Northern support for Reconstruction weakened. Many grew tired of sending troops south. Economic crises shifted attention away from civil rights. Southerners claimed that federal intervention was oppressive and corrupt, and slowly, the political will to protect black rights eroded. In 1877, after a disputed presidential election, a political compromise removed the last federal troops from the South. Reconstruction effectively ended. Southern leaders quickly enacted laws that stripped away voting rights, enforced racial segregation, and re-established white supremacy. The achievements of Reconstruction were rolled back, though never fully erased. Yet despite these setbacks, the legacy of Reconstruction endures. It created the first real attempt to build a multiracial democracy in America. It redefined citizenship. It expanded constitutional rights. And it planted the seeds of the civil rights movement that would emerge nearly a century later. The aftermath of the Civil War was a time of hope and heartbreak. The nation struggled to heal wounds that were deep and painful. Freedmen pursued their dreams of equality and dignity. Some progress took root, some was violently crushed. But the struggle itself reshaped the country. Reconstruction was not a failure, it was a beginning. A bold, imperfect, and ultimately unfinished revolution. And the questions it raised about race, equality, justice, and democracy remain central to American life today. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the bloodshed stopped, but the war itself never truly disappeared. Its echoes live on in the nation's politics, culture, identity, and memory. The Civil War was not just a military conflict. It was a struggle over what America meant and what it could become. Its legacy still shapes the United States today, more than 160 years later. The most profound legacy of the Civil War was the destruction of slavery. 4 million men, women, and children who had been held in bondage were finally free. Their freedom transformed the nation. Families reunited. Communities formed. Churches flourished. Schools emerged. But freedom alone was not enough. For generations, African Americans fought for the full rights promised by the 14th and 15th Amendments. The Civil War opened the door to equality, but the journey through that door would take far longer. It is still not finished. The war also redefined the meaning of the Union. Before 1861, people often referred to the United States as these United States, a collection of separate, sovereign states. After the war, Americans increasingly spoke of the United States as one nation. The idea of an indivisible union, held together by shared values rather than fragile compromises, became central to American identity. But the war's legacy was also divided. In the North, the Union victory symbolized triumph over rebellion and the preservation of democracy. Many saw the war as a moral struggle, righteous victory that proved the nation could overcome its greatest flaw. In the South, the memory of the war evolved differently. Defeat was bitter and humiliating. To cope with loss, some Southerners built a narrative known as the Lost Cause. This myth portrayed the Confederacy as noble and heroic, downplayed slavery as the root cause of the war, and glorified Confederate leaders as defenders of honor and tradition. For generations, this myth shaped school textbooks, monuments, and public memory across the South. The Lost Cause narrative was powerful, but it was not true. The Confederacy fought to preserve slavery. Its leaders said so plainly. Its documents declared it openly. But the myth blurred this reality, making reconciliation between North and South easier at the cost of historical accuracy, at the cost of justice for Black Americans. Monuments played a major role in shaping memory. In town squares, parks, and courthouses, statues of Confederate generals rose across the South not immediately after the war, but decades later during periods of racial tension. These monuments were not just markers of history. They were statements about power, identity, and who belonged in public life. Today, these symbols remain controversial. Some see them as heritage. Others see them as glorifying a cause built on slavery. The debate reflects how deeply the Civil War still lives in American consciousness. The war also changed the role of the federal government. Before the Civil War, the national government was small and limited. Afterwards, it grew in strength and responsibility. The war demanded more centralized control over the military, the economy, communications, and transportation. This shift laid the groundwork for the modern American state. Economically, the North prospered after the war. Industries expanded, railroads multiplied, immigration surged. The United States began to emerge as a global industrial power. In contrast, the South struggled for decades. Its infrastructure was destroyed. Its labor system was shattered. Poverty, inequality, and racial violence shaped its post-war reality. Culturally, the war left behind stories, songs, letters, and literature that continued to shape American imagination. The words of Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, "A new birth of freedom," became part of the nation's soul. The bravery of soldiers, the pain of widows, the resilience of freedmen, and the sacrifices of families became woven into American identity. The Civil War also laid the foundations for the civil rights struggles of the 20th century. The promise of Reconstruction citizenship, equality, and voting rights was betrayed after federal troops withdrew in 1877. Segregation and Jim Crow laws replaced open slavery with a new system of racial oppression. But the constitutional amendments of the Civil War era remained. They were not fully realized for nearly a century, but they provided the legal foundation for the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and countless others. In many ways, the Civil War was the start of a fight that continues today. The fight to define what freedom, equality, and citizenship truly mean in America. The questions raised in the 1860s about race, rights, federal power, and national unities shaped political debates, elections, and social movements. Even the geography of memory remains divided. Some battlefields are preserved as sacred ground, places where visitors walk among silent cannons and read the names of the dead. Other landscapes, once fields of unimaginable suffering, have become neighborhoods, highways, or shopping centers. The war is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Yet the Civil War's deepest legacy is the reminder that the United States has always been a nation striving to live up to its ideals. The war revealed the contradictions at the heart of American freedom for some, oppression for others. It forced the nation to confront those contradictions with unimaginable sacrifice. And it proved that progress, though slow and difficult, is possible. The Civil War changed the Constitution. It changed the government. It changed the economy. It changed the land. It changed millions of lives. But above all, it changed the idea of what America could be. The Union survived. Slavery died. A new chapter began, and though the scars of the war remained in memory, history, and the American landscape that struggled to build a more just and unified nation continues. The Civil War ended on paper in 1865, but its legacy lives on, shaping the United States in every generation that followed.